Well, I'm going to start this off with something that the media doesn't believe, but all of you probably know, and that is that voter fraud is real. Okay, and John Fund and I, who's my co-author sitting here, 4 years ago we published this book, and the reason we published it is I got really tired of hearing all these people saying, "Oh, there's no voter fraud in the United States," including people like the New York Times. So this book is filled with actual cases and prosecutions. Now, something else that I did with the help of my colleagues at the Heritage Foundation is about a year and a half ago, again, I was tired of hearing all these stories, no voter fraud in the United States. But by the way, you all should know in 2008, the U.S. Supreme Court, you can't hear, okay, sorry. In 2008, the U.S. Supreme Court upheld voter ID. They upheld Indiana's voter required a government-issued photo ID. Said it was perfectly constitutional. It was not a burden on voters, any different than the other things you have to do to go vote, like registering to vote. And one of the key phrases in the opinion was that the United States has a long history of voter fraud that's been documented by journalists and historians. Of course, like I said, no one seems to believe that today on the editorial pages of the Washington Post and the New York Times. So about a year and a half ago, we started this database at the Heritage Foundation where I work, and we started putting in voter fraud cases as we ran across them. Now, this is not an extensive research project. We're not going backwards and researching American history. We said we're just going to start putting in cases as we run across them. And to prevent anybody from questioning the data, we're not going to put in information on newspaper reports where somebody says, well, I think something happened, maybe, perhaps. We're only going to put in cases where people have been convicted in a court of law for engaging in fraud, or a judge has ordered a new election because of fraud in the previous election. As of last week, we were up to 492 cases, almost 800 individual convictions, and this is from all across the country. Our interns, our summer interns, that's about the only help I have, we've got about another 100 cases we're going to put in. So this is without even really looking. And I can tell you, this is the tip of the iceberg. There are many, many cases that don't get prosecuted. And I'm going to give you an example of this. Oh, by the way, North Carolina, we have, let's see, we have 11 cases, including Lumberton, North Carolina, and Pembroke, North Carolina, where they keep having to redo their elections because they have so many problems there. Oh, and by the way, we have a guy, conviction from 2015 of a guy named Pasco Parker, who actually lives in Tennessee, but in the 2012 election, he voted in Tennessee, Florida, and North Carolina. Now, the important thing to know about that particular conviction is that he would never have been convicted if we were dependent on election officials, because they didn't discover it. It was the Voting Integrity Project, a grassroots organization that started comparing voter registration lists and found this guy. If it hadn't been for that action by the citizens group, this guy would never have been caught and would never have been prosecuted. And how much of a problem is that? Well, your election board released a report in April based on data from the Interstate Crosscheck Program. The state of Kansas, which is headed by Chris Kobach, probably one of the best secretaries of state in the country, some years ago started a project, and I think there are now 30 states that are part of this project. It's voluntary, and what each state does once a year is they take their statewide voter registration list and they send it to Kansas. And Kansas compares all of the voter registration lists of all the states who are in this. And each state gets back a report that details the names of every individual in that state who's also registered to vote in one of the other states that's part of this Interstate Crosscheck Program. Now, based on the 2014 check, your election board issued a report recently showing that in the 2012 election, when Barack Obama was reelected, there were 765 individuals who voted in North Carolina and another state, and they had an exact match based on the first name, last name, date of birth, and the last 4 digits of their Social Security number. Tennessee, your neighboring state, 218,000. Virginia, 284,000. Georgia, 540,000 people registered in more than one state. Now, the problem, of course, is a lot of states get these reports back and they don't do anything about them. It takes a lot of time, effort, money, and resources to actually start checking this kind of data to make sure that people are not registering and voting. I can tell you, because I know, for example, there are college students all over this country who are registered back where they lived with their parents and then get registered to vote where they're going to school, and they're double voting in elections. Because why? They can get away with it. You know, they're not going to get caught. Now, all these things are problems. You know, people voting in multiple states. Oh, by the way, that report that your election board released also showed 81 deceased voters who had voted after they were dead in North Carolina. But I'll tell you, look, these are all issues and these are all problems. But the really big problem that we don't have a handle on, and I'm not sure we're going to get a handle on unless major actions are taken, is the problem of non-citizens registering and voting in the state. And registering and voting in places all over. I'm on the board of the Public Interest Legal Foundation. It's probably the only organization that's dedicated to trying to improve election integrity. And if you all haven't seen it, we just put out a report, really clever I thought, called The Alien Invasion of Virginia. And let me tell you what we did is we used federal law to demand taking a look at voter registration records in counties in Virginia. They put up a heck of a battle. We had to sue a lot of the counties, even though they have an obligation. Any member of the public, under federal law, under the National Voter Registration Act, has a right to see voter registration records. They refused to do it. In fact, they were instructed by the state election board not to give us that information. We had to sue. We found that more than 5,500 aliens had been removed from the voter rolls, many of whom had voted in prior elections. They had cast almost 7,500 ballots. Now, 5,500 aliens doesn't sound like a lot, but what you have to understand is that these were all people who were caught because they self-reported that they were not U.S. citizens. And what I mean by that is they went to DMV, they got a license, they got registered to vote, many of them voted, but then the next time they went back to renew their license, they admitted, well, actually, I'm not really a U.S. citizen. So these are people who basically self-admitted they weren't U.S. citizens, and so they're able to take them off of the rolls. We don't know how many more voters there are in Virginia who are not U.S. citizens who registered and are continuing to vote. Again, 5,500, well, it doesn't sound like a lot. 7,500 ballots, well, it doesn't sound like a lot given how big Virginia is, until you start looking at the fact that many local races are decided by a handful of votes. We've had two statewide attorney general's races decided in the state of Virginia by less than 1,000 votes. So there are enough aliens having voted in the state to have decided those two elections. I have at least 3 decisions sitting on my desk from the 7th Circuit U.S. Court of Appeals. Now, anybody who's a lawyer knows, we have this huge federal court system. Not that many cases, a small percentage of cases get up into the appeals courts, right? all three of these appeals court cases, many of them recent, all involve non-citizens who came to the United States. They all came here legally, you know, on visas, promptly moved to Illinois, went and got a driver's license, registered to vote, and voted. And the only reason there's a federal court opinion about them was not because Illinois election officials discovered they were aliens and were illegally voting. No, it's because they all applied for a change of status with the Department of Homeland Security, and at that point, DHS ran a check and discovered that they had registered and voted. Now, I can tell you, because I know this, because I've heard this from agents within DHS, they have hundreds, if not thousands, of files at the Department of Homeland Security from individuals who, when they applied for U.S. citizenship, I don't know if you all know this, but if you look at the form, question 12 asks you, have you ever registered or voted in an election in the United States? And they have thousands of files in which people have said, yes, we did. Now, all of these cases I'm talking about, the 5,500 aliens who were removed from the rolls in Virginia, the individuals who, when they were applying for citizenship, admitted they were U.S. citizens, do you think a single one of those was forwarded to law enforcement officials for investigation and prosecution? Absolutely not. I was on a county election board in Virginia, Fairfax County. I pushed the election board to start checking DMV records, and we discovered almost 300 individuals who were not U.S. citizens and who had registered to vote. About half of them had voted in prior elections. We took them off the rolls and forwarded them to the local district attorney. Care to guess what was done with those files? Absolutely nothing. So I'm talking here about thousands. You know, I got a database of about 500 cases right now. And we're talking thousands of more voter fraud cases that have never been pursued. Not a single county in Virginia that took any of these aliens off the rolls forwarded that information to law enforcement for investigation and prosecution. Not a single one of them. By the way, Kansas is one of the few states that has tried to do something about this. Kansas actually passed a great law, and this is something every state should do, although these laws have been tied up in the courts just like voter ID. Kansas passed a law that said that when you register to vote, you got to provide proof you're a U.S. citizen. Now, why do you think they did that? Well, I'll tell you why. The county election officials in Sedgwick County, Kansas, decided it would really be a good thing to go to the citizenship ceremony in their county at the U.S. courthouse. And as soon as the new citizens had been sworn in and become citizens, to offer them the ability to register to vote. Of course, they did that, but discovered that more than a dozen of them didn't need to register to vote because they already were registered to vote. Now, how big of a problem is this? All right, well, in 2011, 3 academics from Old Dominion University in Virginia and George Mason University, who are now academic pariahs, released a report based on congressional survey data. And based on that congressional survey data, they estimated that in the 2008 election, when Barack Obama was first elected, that 6.4% of the non-citizens in the United States voted. They estimated that in the 2010 election, the congressional election, when of course turnout goes down, 2.2% of the non-citizens voted in that election. Now again, 6.4%, well, that doesn't sound like that large a number. However, they pointed out in their study that if that number held true, that 6.4% of the non-citizens in the country voted, that would mean that in the state of North Carolina, which Barack Obama won by 14,000 votes, non-citizens could have decided the state. And the electoral votes could have been decided by them. I think Governor McCrory White just mentioned he lost by 10,000 votes. That's well within the margin of what these academics were saying. Now, there were a lot of critics of this study. They said the survey data was too small, but there have been other studies done. John John and I have cited them in a piece we did for Fox News. For example, after this November election, the one we just had, America's Majority Foundation did a post-election survey. That survey, they estimated that 2.1% of non-citizens voted in the November 8th election, 2.5% in Michigan, 2.1% in Ohio. Which party does that help? Well, it helps the Democratic Party because surveys of non-citizens show that they break about 80-20 Democrat versus Republican. By the way, one other source of data on this is jury information. And again, this is something that nobody's doing anything with. I know one county, I have information on one county in Virginia, for example. They average about 1,500 people a year who are called for jury duty for the state court system. And they are excused from jury duty. Why? Because they're not U.S. citizens. Now, where do you think court clerks get juries from? They get them from the voter registration list. There's actually a GAO report that was done about 10 years ago on this, and they found that in just one of the federal district court systems in the United States, 3% of the 30,000 people called for jury duty in 2 years were excused because they were not U.S. citizens. So that's what, 3,000 people. You start adding that up all over the country, and remember, not everybody gets called for jury duty, and after a while, you're starting to talk about big numbers. A certain political party is so afraid of this information that 2 years ago, the Virginia legislature, with some recommendations that I had made, actually passed a great bill that would have required jury commissioners to forward information on individuals who are excused from jury duty because they are not U.S. citizens, have moved out of state, or are felons, to county election officials so they can be taken off the rolls. It was vetoed by Governor McAuliffe. Now, there is no public policy ground you can come up with to veto that unless you want to ensure that people who are ineligible to vote, including non-citizens, will continue to register and continue to vote. Now, I'm talking to you about all the problems here, and what are the solutions to this? And again, don't get me wrong. I'm not telling you that there's massive voter fraud going on across the United States. But there's certainly enough fraud to make a difference in close elections. And some places are worse than others. Some states do a pretty good job of trying to clean up their voter lists. Other states, like California, do absolutely nothing to try to clean up their voter lists. In fact, you all may know California, which issues driver's licenses to not just legal non-citizens, which every state does, but to illegal aliens. I think last year they issued more than 500,000 driver's licenses to illegal aliens. And what has California just implemented? An automatic voter registration system so that anybody who's got a driver's license is automatically registered to vote. And they don't distinguish between citizens and non-citizens. They said it'll be up to the individual driver's license holder to notify the state that they should not be registered. Okay, if you can imagine that. All right, so what are the solutions? Well, voter ID is an obvious one. You all tried to do that, and you got sabotaged by partisan, activist, liberal judges. I know that's the case because the federal district court judge that upheld your voter ID law wrote the longest district court opinion I've ever read, 500 pages. And he went through in great detail through all the factual evidence concerning your voter ID law and the other changes you had made. And what was so amazing about this case was that all the experts that were brought in by the people who attacked your election reforms, and that included the U.S. Justice Department and other groups, they brought all these experts in who testified on the stand that, oh my gosh, these so-called reforms are going to depress turnout. Turnout is going to go down, particularly the turnout of minority voters. Well, everything except the voter ID law, all the reforms except for the voter ID law, they were in place for the 2014 election, so we've got actual turnout data, and what happened? Your turnout skyrocketed. The turnout, for example, of African Americans in the state reached like an all-time high, went way up. And in fact, I made a great enemy with someone I used to know, a professor at MIT, which is my alma mater, because I embarrassed him in an article at National Review. Why? Because he actually got up in court, if you can imagine this. He actually got up in court and said that African American North Carolinians could not cope with these election reforms because they are less sophisticated than other. That is one of the most racist statements I've ever heard, and yet this was the expert put up by the Obama Justice Department and the NAACP and others. And of course, it turned out not to be true, obviously. You know, turnout went way up. So the federal district court judge upholds your ID law and the other changes, and it gets overturned by a 3-judge panel of the Fourth Circuit, 2 Obama appointees, and I think a Clinton appointee. Now, what was clear was that they were acting in a partisan manner, not issuing a legal decision. And I'm going to tell you the most obvious way you know that. North Carolina is surrounded by Georgia, Tennessee, Virginia, and South Carolina. Every one of those states has a voter ID law that's been upheld in the courts. The South Carolina law is virtually identical to the North Carolina law, which has this gigantic exception in it. You know, the legislature amended the law and put in a reasonable impediment exemption that says if you show up at a polling place without an ID, as long as you fill out a 1-page form that says I had a reasonable impediment that kept me from getting an ID, you get to vote. That is identical to the law South Carolina passed. The Holder Justice Department said, well, you can't implement that law. South Carolina went to court, sued Eric Holder, and won. A 3-judge panel of the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals said, that's not discriminatory. Georgia's law doesn't have an exception like that. It made it through the courts and it survived. So it's very clear that your law is not discriminatory, no matter what these judges say about it. But you know, you've got this unfortunate problem of bad judges. And you were unable to get the U.S. Supreme Court to overturn the case. Why? Because you have an unethical attorney general. And I'm going to say that straight out. I actually wrote an article about this. You may all know the details of this, but you know, your newly elected attorney general, as soon as he got in, the state legislature, their lawyer, had filed an appeal of this bad Fourth Circuit decision with the U.S. Supreme Court. The new attorney general, as soon as he came in, filed a pleading with the U.S. Supreme Court saying, oh, the state of North Carolina is withdrawing the appeal. Now, the problem with that is that he didn't consult with the client, the state legislature, and get their permission to do it, but most importantly, and this is not a gray area, this is a black and white issue. If you are a lawyer and you are a witness in a case, you cannot then act as a lawyer representing one of the parties. That is a straight out rule in the Professional Code of Conduct in every single state. Well, your attorney general was a fact witness in the lawsuit. And then he comes in acting as the attorney general and basically violates this ethics rule. And so the Supreme Court said, we are not going to accept the petition for certiorari and review this case because of this procedural chaos. We have the legislature saying we want it reviewed. We have the attorney general saying we don't want it reviewed, and they weren't going to jump into that. And I will tell you this. If the North Carolina Bar Association does not act in what is a straight out, no questionable violation of the ethics rules governing lawyers in this state, then that will be a sign that the Bar Association is giving in to politics and is not doing their job of policing the legal profession. there are all kinds of things that should be done. I mean, some of the most basic ones that election officials don't do is, look, when people register to vote, when they get a form coming in of someone registering to vote, they should be taking advantage of modern technology. They need to run that information against the tax records that the county has to make sure that that's a real address and that it's got a house on it and it's not a vacant lot. They ought to be checking Google Earth for every single address for the same reason. To check also to make sure it's not a commercial address. You know, if it's a business, you can't register at a business. They're not doing most basic things like that. They need to be doing database comparisons with Department of Homeland Security to check alien records to make sure the person is not a non-citizen. There's all kinds of things they need to be doing like that. The other thing states need to do is, as I said before, make sure that all jury information is then sent to election officials and sent to prosecutors so they can investigate if there's been a violation of the law. Some of those may be mistakes. Someone who mistakenly got registered when they're not a citizen. But there's all kinds of different places where information can be gotten that election officials just aren't doing it. And even when they have information, they're not doing anything with it. And I'm talking about the data they're getting from the cross-check program of people who are registered in more than one state. They've got to do something with that information because election integrity is very important. You know, I'm a first-generation American. I really love this country. You know, my mother was German. She grew up in Nazi Germany. My father was Russian. He escaped the communists twice. And both of them always said to me that we were really lucky to be growing up in this country. And the only way we can maintain the kind of democratic republic we are is if we have secure elections with integrity where everybody actually trusts the outcome. So even the losing party can say, well, I lost the race, but it was a fair race and it was done the way it should be. So now I'll be happy to answer questions. Yes, ma'am.
Has there been a bar complaint filed against the Attorney General?
I don't know. I certainly hope so. Jay?
Thank you for the plug there. Just something for you to know about Pasco Parker.
Right.
He used a different social in Tennessee than he did in North Carolina. So he's not one of your quick people that could have been found in that cross-check. It took some detective work to find him, actually. Also, there's a House bill right now that's been approved to do the jury information.
Good.
It's been approved through the House. It's sitting in the Senate. And sitting next to me is a senator who's actually sponsored the bill.
Yeah, that's good.
Please call your senators and ask them.
Right. Now, I want to say, look, it's important for the state to do that. But, you know, right now, President Trump is in the process of choosing who the U.S. attorneys are for the state of North Carolina. And there is another source of jury information in this state, and that's the jury information from the federal courts. And one of the requirements ought to be, for anybody who's going to be the U.S. attorney, is a promise that that U.S. attorney is going to start getting the information from the clerks of the federal district courts and forwarding that information to state election officials, because the federal courts also, like I said, they pull their jury information from state election lists. Yes, sir.
I understand that Trump has appointed a commission to look into this. Have you heard any results of anything they've done so far?
About 3 weeks ago, the president signed an executive order establishing a presidential advisory commission on basically election integrity. It's going to be chaired by the vice president and I think co-chaired by Chris Kobach, the Secretary of State of Kansas, who I mentioned before. It's going to have up to 15 members. It is not yet started operating. They're still getting the other members. So far, they've only named, I think, 5 members of the commission. Chris Kobach, the Secretaries of State of Indiana, Maine, and Vermont. New Hampshire, right? And Christy McCormick, who is a Republican commissioners on the U.S. Election Assistance Commission. So I think probably in the next 2 or 3 weeks, the White House will announce who the other members are, and then they'll get to work.
You are gonna get this information to them, I hope.
I plan on printing out a copy of our voter fraud database and giving it to the commission, yes.
Thank you, thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Do you think there's any way of enforcing the automatic registration when you're getting your license and make it a proactive situation to have to go and apply, register to vote?
Well, California,
I know
Oregon, Illinois, all have put in automatic registration, and there's no way to prevent that because it's a decision of the state legislature, and they've decided they're going to do it. There's a push to do this all over the country, and I would urge state legislators everywhere not to give in to that. All the way in the back. Yeah.
Hans J. Staub, they used to live in the People's Republic of Fairfax County.
Right.
Michigan.
Where I now live.
I wanted to reinforce what you just said there about voter fraud. I was called for jury duty about 10 years ago, and there was a pool of about 30 people. They picked 12 to go to jury duty, and I personally observed 2 individuals that came in. One spoke no English, had a translator, the other spoke in English, and they dismissed them because they weren't citizens. So that's about 6% of the people for that jury pool that should have been there because they had voted illegally. The other is a question. The Indiana law that you referred to with photo ID.
Right.
What I read and understand is that the North Carolina law basically mirrored that law, that it passed Supreme Court muster. And that the fourth then came in and overruled it. So how do we get rid of activist judges? Obviously, if this thing mirrors like I understood it, how could they come in and say it's discriminatory and then we're suffering
Right.
consequences?
Well, here was the difference. The challenge to the Indiana law was under the Constitution. The plaintiffs claimed it was unconstitutional to require a photo ID. The lawsuit against the North Carolina law and the lawsuits, for example, against the Georgia and South Carolina laws were based on the Voting Rights Act, not the Constitution. They were saying that the laws were discriminatory under the Voting Rights Act. The plaintiffs basically had to switch to try to use the Voting Rights Act because of the fact the Supreme Court had upheld the constitutionality of it. The only way this is going to get fixed is when one of these cases does get to the Supreme Court, a case involving the Voting Rights Act, and hopefully the court will do the right thing on that. Yes, sir.
Why hasn't there been any prosecution? I mean, I've been an election judge now for 12 years, and I've seen at least 5 people go through the election process that they were clearly not citizens, okay, for a whole host of reasons to include the address. And they got caught. And there were 32 people reported as being not okay to vote. And nothing ever happened to it. I mean, it came right out of Wake County system.
Look, a lot of DAs just aren't interested in prosecuting these cases, unfortunately, and I don't know what to tell you about that other than you need pressure. You've got to pressure the local DAs to do that. Now, an alternative to that, if you can do this, is, again, going back to Kansas. Chris Kobach was also frustrated because local county DAs in the state were not prosecuting these cases. And look, some of it's political. Others is, when they're prosecuting murders and rapes and bank robberies and assaults, election crime doesn't seem that important, that much of a priority. So what Kobach did is he actually went to the state legislature and asked them to give the Secretary of State the authority to prosecute voter fraud cases. And so he set up a whole team of people. I think he's now working on his 12th prosecution after having gotten that authority. So that's an alternative to it. Yes, ma'am.
In North Carolina, voter fraud is a class I felony, which is as low as you can get.
Right.
And I think what we need to do is get the legislature to increase the felony because most district attorneys have other things that are much more pressing, like violence and drugs, and don't have the staff to go after voter fraud. But if it were a higher felony, they might. Class I is mostly a slap on the hand.
Yeah, no, I think you should consider that. But the other thing, again, going back to the feds, is remember there are a lot of election crimes are also federal crimes if there's a federal candidate on the ballot. And again, if I had anything to do with making recommendations to the White House about who's going to be the U.S. attorneys in this state, I would want to get somebody who has a commitment to finding, investigating, and prosecuting election crimes. And again, this isn't difficult. If I can go back to the jury information for just a second, all any U.S. attorney's office has to do is go find out, well, who got called for jury duty for a federal court case and was excused because they're not a U.S. citizen. All right, get the names of those people and then check, were they taken from the voter registration list? Well, if they were, they've committed a felony. And those cases couldn't be easier to investigate and prosecute, and yet I don't know of a single U.S. attorney anywhere in the entire country that is doing these kinds of cases.
I think we have time. I hate to do this to everybody. Maybe two more questions.
Two more questions?
Two or three, maybe.
Front row, here.
Yeah, I think you've done a great job of pointing out maybe 2 or 3 means of voter fraud occurring. I'm totally convinced there, but it strikes me that there's many, many other ways that fraud could potentially occur.
Oh, yeah.
And, that could be listed, and maybe you've thought about that or others have thought about that, but has it ever happened, or do you have any thoughts on, say, doing really a true forensic audit, so to speak, of an election that's already occurred, using all these means of potential fraud and investigating? It would be expensive. Has this ever crossed your mind? Any thoughts on that? Maybe somebody's done it?
Well, I haven't done it, but one of the bills that the Virginia legislature passed this term would have provided for those kinds of audits, and they were vetoed by Governor McAuliffe. Actually, one of the best descriptions of the kind that kind of, it wasn't an audit, but it kind of does what you're saying. And one of the best descriptions of all the different ways that fraud occurs is, and I've written about this, in 1982, in the governor's race in Illinois, after the election was over, a disgruntled campaign worker, precinct worker, called the FBI field office in Chicago. Okay, he was angry because he had been promised a city job if he helped stuff the ballot box on election day. Okay. So the FBI opened up an investigation that by the end involved every single agent in the FBI field office. It was ended up being the largest voter fraud prosecution the U.S. Justice Department ever conducted. But most importantly, the federal grand jury, federal grand juries operate in secrecy. But this federal grand jury believed that its findings were so important that it published its grand jury report. And the grand jury report goes through and details all the different ways that fraud was committed in the city of Chicago in that election. The estimate by the U.S. Attorney was that there were 100,000 fraudulent ballots cast. And it covered everything from impersonation fraud of the polls to vote buying to absentee ballot fraud, which is a very big part of how elections are stolen, which is why states that only put in photo ID for in-person voting are making a big mistake. What they need to do is do what states like Kansas, Alabama, Wisconsin have done, which is their photo ID laws apply to both in-person voting and absentee balloting.